Hello everyone. We're going to continue moving through our series of lessons on heresy and orthodoxy. And today we've got a nice little tight package of the three M's: Marcion, Mani, and Montanist. These three men led different movements, although as you will find out, I'm not convinced that Montanist was a heretic. Certainly the other guys were. So let's move on into this section. Marcion often was considered the arch heretic, the most significant and dangerous heretic of all. Now, he was the son of a bishop in Pontus, which is located in what is now modern Turkey, and so he had a strong background in the church. He became a wealthy shipbuilder and owner of a fleet of ships, but it's said that he was excommunicated for immorality. Now, this information comes to us from Tertullian, who, as you know, was very powerful and creative with his rhetoric. What he said was that Marcion violated the Virgin. So it may have been an inappropriate sexual action toward a young woman, or it may have been that he violated the church, and that Tertullian was using a virgin as a metaphor for the church. Nonetheless, either he was sexually immoral or he was a heretic, but nonetheless, he was excommunicated from his father's church, and therefore he moved to Rome around 140. Okay, picture this: it's just over 100 years after the life, ministry, the death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Now, when he arrived in Rome, he gave a large donation to the church, but when he began to preach his heretical teaching, the church gave it back. All right, must have been pretty bad, and indeed it was. And he set up a rival church that endured for centuries. All right, what was Marcion's heresy? He taught that the Christian gospel is a gospel of love, all right, to the exclusion of the law. And he wrote a treatise called the Antitheses. All right, he believed that the gospel includes nothing but love, no wrath. And so he objected to Jehovah of the Old Testament. He said that he was not the same God as the God of love in the New Testament gospel. He claimed that Jehovah of the Old Testament was capricious, ignorant, despotic, cruel, and that when Jesus came, he revealed the supreme God of love. And Jesus' purpose was to overthrow Jehovah. Now, Marcion claimed that Christ was not begotten of Jehovah, nor born of Mary. Instead, he appeared as a grown man, and his passion and death were the result of Jehovah. Now, because of his hatred of Jehovah, his understanding of Jehovah as a God of wrath, he rejected the entire Old Testament. He rejected all of the law, and he accepted only certain Christian writings, 10 of the letters of Paul, and then the Gospel of Luke. But even so, he edited all Old Testament references out, which means that he left out much of these writings. Now, it should be clear that his preference for Luke came about because Luke was a Gentile and not a Jew. And he preferred Paul's letters because Paul was the apostle to the Gentiles. And so these were the books that he accepted and considered authoritative. The other Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and John, were tainted by Jewish law. And so, this is an interesting bit of trivia. The canon compiled by Marcion was the earliest known list of New Testament scriptures. Far too narrow, of course, but nonetheless, the earliest list of anyone who had compiled the scriptures that he considered authoritative. Now, this is going to become important because the early church fathers then, in reaction to Marcion's far too narrow canon, are going to begin to consider, if Marcion is incorrect, then what is the correct canon of scriptures? And this will be a topic that we'll get to very soon. But next, let's go on to Manichaeism, which originated in Persia by a Babylonian named Mani. And this was a syncretism of Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, Gnosticism, and Christianity. So he's pulling together aspects of these different religions. And Mani taught an extreme dualism. He taught that light and darkness are both co-eternal forces that are opposed to each other, and they are equally powerful and influential in the universe, so that the universe consists of a battle between light and darkness. The human condition is a result of the light or the spirit trapped in darkness, the body. And salvation comes about by separating the light from the dark and preparing the spirit for its return to light. And according to Manichaeism, humans do not have free will. Instead, they are dominated by either the light or the dark. Now, the Manichaeism was organized with really two levels of participants. The leadership was known as the elect or the perfect, and these were the spiritual priests, so to speak. And they were a spiritual priestly elite. They mediate between the kingdom of light and the lower class. They practiced asceticism and devotions, and so they were exceptionally zealous in their faith and their devotions. They administered baptism and communion, and these sacraments were necessary for salvation to those who were the auditors or the hearers. All right, these were the common people who served the elite, the perfect elect, and thereby they received the baptism and communion necessary for their separation from darkness into light. Okay, so they studied under the elect, but they did not submit to the strict asceticism of the elect. They were allowed to marry. They were allowed to work because they needed to produce an income that they could share with the elect, who of course were too ascetic and devoted and too spiritual to work. And so they participated in the holiness of the elect by providing them the necessities of life and by receiving sacraments. Manichaeism becomes important for us to know because later, when we study the great church father Augustine, we're going to find out that before he converted to Christianity, he was greatly influenced by Manichaeism. And then, even later, when we arrive in our study of the medieval church, we're going to find that Manichaeism is revived in a major heresy that is very divisive in the medieval church. And so Manichaeism is important because of its influence elsewhere. All right, so now it's time to talk about Montanism, which I consider not so much a heresy as a reforming sect. And just full disclosure, Montanism was part of my dissertation. We've already looked at the Passion of Perpetua, which was the focus of my dissertation, but a secondary focus was on Montanism because I considered the influence of Montanism on the participants in the Passion of Perpetua. All right, so let's find out more about what Montanism was. All right, the leaders of Montanism included Montanists, after whom the movement is named, although I must say that those followers of this movement, they called it the New Prophecy. They considered themselves new prophets. That is, they were reviving the ministry of prophecy in the church. But opponents who were outside looking on critically, they called it Montanism after the name of Montanist of Phrygia, which was located in the central region of modern Turkey. Do you see how I mentioned Turkey over and over and over again? This region known as Asia Minor back then was a very important part of the development of the church. Now, Montanus was assisted by two women, Priscilla and Maximilla. They're considered co-founders of this movement. Montanus began preaching around 156. Just to keep this in a timeline, this is the same year that Polycarp was martyred. Now, Montanus claimed to be the mouthpiece of the Paraclete. We understand that the word Paraclete comes from the Gospel of John, and this is Jesus' term for the Holy Spirit, coming from the Greek word parakletos, meaning to call alongside, and often it's translated advocate, comforter, and helper, and so on. But Montanus, because he's in Phrygia in Turkey, he's very near Ephesus, the region where John later on became a pastor. And so we see a lot of influence of the Johannine literature on Montanus, and here's certainly one example, his use of the term paraclete for the Holy Spirit. All right, he claimed to be the mouthpiece for the paraclete. Now, his critics elsewhere in the region believed that Montanus was actually claiming to be the paraclete. So he was claiming divinity for himself. That's not the way I read his statements. Instead, I see him in the tradition of the Old Testament prophets who would say, "Thus saith the Lord," and then they would speak the words of the Lord that they had received from him. And so Montanus felt like he was proclaiming truths that he had heard from the Paraclete. Now, Montanus criticized the established church. All right, they looked around and felt like the church in Asia Minor was growing formalistic, emphasizing uniformity and the rule by bishops. Okay, they felt that those who rule the church should be those who demonstrated their indwelling of the Holy Spirit through speaking in tongues. They believed that the established church emphasized knowledge more than faith. The established church did not emphasize adequately church discipline and morality, and the Montanists were extremely zealous in their austere ascetic lifestyle. And very important was that the Montanists expected Christ's return soon, and the established church had less emphasis on that expectation. And so much of their zealous ascetic lifestyle was inspired by their expectation that Christ would return soon. And so Montanism was a movement to reform the church to its New Testament origins. Now, in Asia Minor, the established church condemned Montanism. In Rome, the bishop almost decided to accept Montanists, but Praxeas came from Asia Minor and convinced the Pope to reject the Montanists. However, Praxeas was a much worse heretic. He was a modalist, one of the Patripassionists. And so Tertullian, who by this time was an adherent of Montanism, he made this statement: "By this Praxeas did a twofold service for the devil at Rome. He drove away prophecy and he brought in heresy. He put to flight the Paraclete and he crucified the Father." One of Tertullian's neatest expressions of rhetoric, but nonetheless, Tertullian was very angry with Praxeas and accused him of modalism, and wrote his treatise against Praxeas, and not only defended Montanism and criticized modalism, but it was in this treatise where Tertullian presented his two most important doctrinal formula, the Trinitarian formula and the Christological formula, which we've already studied. All right, so Montanism was problematic in Asia Minor and in Rome, but in Carthage and North Africa, Montanists thrived. They actually continued to worship in the established house churches, and so they were not only were they not excommunicated, but they were actually welcomed and continued to worship with the Christians of the established churches. However, they did meet privately and separately in what we would call conventicles, a church within the church. Tertullian, of course, was the most famous adherent of Montanism. Now, here's a list of the Montanist beliefs. First, and foremost, the emphasis on the Spirit. And those who were Montanists practiced ecstatic prophecy and glossolalia, or speaking in tongues. Now, the one aspect of Montanism that is questionable is that they believed in immediate revelation. That is, the revelation given by the Spirit to the new prophets were equal in authority to the written scriptures that by this time were already being circulated, especially the Gospels and the letters of Paul. And so they advocated for an open canon, believing that the Holy Spirit was continuing to inspire scriptures. Obviously, we strongly disagree with this idea, and the early church fathers disagreed as well. And again, we'll soon talk about canonization, but the movement toward canonization was an action against Marcion, who had a too narrow canon, and against the Montanists, whose canon was too wide open. All right, what were other emphases in Montanism? Women's leadership in ministry. The Holy Spirit could choose anyone through whom to work and speak. And so obviously we've already talked about Priscilla and Maximilla. There were others named like Quintilla, who was a Montanist leader. Perhaps Perpetua was a Montanist leader of her group. All right, they practiced strict asceticism. Their fasting was greater and more narrow, more zealous than the fasting of the established church. They would not allow a second marriage even after the death of a spouse. If a spouse died and a Christian remarried, that was considered bigamy. For one reason, the spouse was considered to be still living even after death. But even more, they believed that God had ordained singlehood through the widowhood, and that the spouse left behind should accept singlehood and then could serve the church uh, uh, more zealously. All right. Okay, there was no forgiveness for post-baptismal sin. We talked about the Shepherd of Hermas, which allowed one exception for sin after baptism, but for the Montanists, there was no forgiveness for post-baptismal sin. Now, they did differentiate between serious sins and light sins. Serious sins included apostasy, sexual sin, murder, thievery, lying. Those sins were serious and could not be forgiven by the church. Now, they could be forgiven by God after death, but the church could not forgive and therefore must excommunicate anyone who had committed such serious sin. All right, they advocated voluntary martyrdom, and they forbade anyone to flee persecution. Now, think of Satyrus, the teacher of Perpetua and Felicitas and others. He volunteered as a Christian, to be imprisoned and to be executed. And so that's another example of a Montanist practice that we see in the Passion of Perpetua. And then there was an emphasis on the immediate return of Christ. Montanists actually had a prophecy that Christ would return at a specific spot that he named Pepuza and Timian. And more recently, one of the great scholars of Montanism is William Tabernet, and he has done research on site in Turkey, and he's found the place that he believes is Pepuza and Timian, where Montanists expected Christ to return. And this space is the equivalent of the dimensions of the New Jerusalem in the book of Revelation. So interesting. But the bottom line is that Montanus and his followers emphasize the immediate return of Christ. We'll stop here after surveying the three M's. And when we gather again, I'll talk about heresies today, and we'll look at how what we have learned about heresy can be applied as we face heretical teachings today. So stay tuned for the next segment of our study of heresy and orthodoxy.